All right, so Election Day is just a week away,
Yeah.
and I know you're all glued to those polls.
Yeah.
It's a total nail-biter.
It is.
This race
Like,
is
wow.
both nationally and in those crucial swing states.
Absolutely.
So we've been digging deep
Yeah,
into all the latest election news and expert commentary
for sure.
and polling data.
Of course.
And honestly, you guys,
Yeah.
you're not going to believe some of the stuff we found.
It's really interesting.
Okay, so paint the picture for us. What are we looking at nationally?
So nationally right now, the latest polls have Harris with a slim 1.1 point lead over Trump.
Okay.
Just to put that in perspective.
Yeah.
Biden was cruising with a 7.4 point lead at this point in 2020.
Wow.
And even Clinton had a 4.6 point cushion in 2016.
That's a crazy difference.
Yeah, this election.
So what's going on? Why is this race so much closer this time around?
Well, it's a combination of factors. Polarization is definitely playing a role, but we're also seeing a potential shift in the electoral landscape. Voters are disillusioned with both parties, and they're looking for something different.
Okay, so if the national picture is a dead heat, then those battleground states become even more important, right?
Absolutely. Every vote.
Every vote in those states is going to be crucial.
Especially in certain counties that act like political weather vanes.
Yeah.
So let's play political meteorologist for a minute. Zoom in on some of those key counties.
Okay.
Where do we start?
Let's head to Michigan and take a look at Kent County.
Okay.
Traditionally a Republican stronghold, it flipped to Biden in 2020.
All right, so Kent County goes blue in 2020. Why should our listener care?
Because it signals a potential trend. Some are calling the revenge of the norm.
Okay.
Essentially what it means is that voters who typically lean Republican are pushing back against what they see as extremism within their own party.
Gotcha.
And Kent County is a pretty good example of this.
Predominantly white, fairly wealthy, well-educated.
Yeah.
These are the folks who might be feeling left behind by the Republican Party's current direction.
So these revenge of the norm voters, they're not necessarily jumping ship to the Democrats, but they're hesitant to support their own party's candidate.
Yeah.
What should we watch for in Kent County this time around?
Keep an eye on something we call the Delta.
The Delta?
The difference in votes between the Republican House candidate, Mike Rogers, and Trump.
Okay.
If Rogers significantly outperforms Trump,
Yeah.
it suggests those soft Republicans are turning away from the top of the ticket.
Okay, so Rogers is like the canary in the coal mine for Trump in Kent County. Got it. Let's hop over to another battleground state, North Carolina.
Sure.
Our county spotlight here is Nash County.
Yeah.
Fill us in. What's the story there?
So Nash County is really interesting. It's rural, working class, and has a significant African-American population, about 42.1%. Black voter turnout in this county will be absolutely crucial for Harris's chances in North Carolina.
Speaking of turnout, I was just looking at the numbers from 2016 to 2020 in Nash County, and they're pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
Turnout jumped massively, and it wasn't just Nash County either.
Yeah, it was nationwide.
But Nash County really stands out.
It does.
So if that level of engagement continues,
Yeah.
particularly among those working class Black voters
Right.
who might not always vote,
Yeah,
it could tip the scales for Harris and the whole state.
it could.
All right, so we've got Michigan and North Carolina on our radar. Now let's head west to Arizona.
Okay.
I feel like we're always hearing about Arizona being a nail-biter.
It always is.
So early voting numbers, they're currently showing a Republican advantage. And the GOP holds a 2-point registration lead statewide.
Yeah.
So if Arizona is this super tight race, are there any specific counties we should be watching?
Absolutely.
You know, the ones that might give us a clue about who's going to win the whole enchilada?
Scottsdale County is leaning Republican,
Okay.
while Tempe is leaning Democrat. They're kind of microcosms of the larger political divide.
All right, so we've got these key counties and swing states to keep our eyes on. Now let's switch gears and talk about a potential game changer, the gender gap.
Okay.
This is where things get really interesting. The polling data suggests we could see a historic gender gap in this election.
That's right.
It's a trend that's been growing for decades, but this year it could be the deciding factor.
He really could.
We're definitely seeing it reflected in a recent NBC poll, which shows Harris with commanding 17-point lead among women voters.
Yeah. And here's the twist. Trump has an even bigger lead among male voters.
Wow.
That same NBC poll shows a 29-point gender gap.
So what does this mean for the election? Could the gender gap really swing the whole thing?
It all comes down to turnout, really.
Okay.
If women voters, especially those energized by the issues Harris is championing,
Yeah.
show up in record numbers, it could completely offset Trump's advantage with men.
Right.
However, if turnout among men is equally high, it could neutralize that advantage and leave us with a dead heat.
So turnout is key,
Yeah, it's a turnout tug of war.
with men and women pulling in opposite directions.
Yeah.
All right, so both campaigns are laser focused on their strategies for these last few days. But I imagine there are some concerns too, right?
Absolutely.
So for Harris, the focus is on building a coalition of suburban voters and former Republicans.
Mhm.
That makes sense given what we were just talking about with the gender gap
Mhm.
and those revenge of the norm voters.
Right.
What other factors make this strategy appealing for Harris?
Well, suburban voters are more concentrated geographically,
Okay.
which makes it easier for campaigns to target them with their message
Right.
and get out the vote efforts. Plus, they historically have higher turnout rates than other groups.
Okay.
They're reliable voters.
So they're easier to reach and they're more likely to vote.
That's right.
That's a winning combo.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what about Trump? What's his campaign strategy in this final stretch?
Trump is sticking with his familiar playbook, immigration rhetoric. In fact, at his recent Madison Square Garden rally, he made a very controversial statement calling for the death penalty for migrants who kill American citizens.
Yikes. How's that playing with voters?
It's a double-edged sword.
Okay.
It definitely resonates with his base,
Mm-hmm.
who are drawn to his hardline stance on immigration.
Yeah.
But it could alienate moderate voters who might find it too extreme.
So it's like throwing red meat to his base while potentially scaring away moderate voters.
Yeah.
It's a risky strategy.
Very risky.
And then there's the issue that both campaigns are grappling with, the potential for election violence.
yeah.
It's a sad reality that we have to worry about this, but it's a real concern.
Unfortunately, it is.
We're seeing increased security measures at voting centers across the country,
That's right.
which I think reflects the level of anxiety and tension
For sure.
surrounding this election.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that everyone's on edge. So with just a week to go, what are the key takeaways for our listener?
The most important thing is to remember that every single vote counts. This election is neck and neck, and it's impossible to predict the outcome.
That's right. And it's not just about voting, it's about staying informed
Yeah.
and engaged
Mm.
and resisting the urge to tune out the noise.
Exactly.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about a group of voters who could really shake things up in this election. The infrequent voters,
Yeah.
they're kind of like the silent majority.
These
These
are-
are the folks who don't typically vote in every election,
Mhm.
and they could be the deciding factor this year
They really could.
because their votes could literally tip the scales,
Yeah.
especially in those razor-thin margins we're seeing in battleground states.
That's right.
It's like they hold the key to the kingdom, but they don't always use it.
Exactly.
And here's something interesting.
Yeah.
Democrats are seeing increased turnout among these infrequent voters,
That's right.
which could be a major advantage for Harris.
It could.
So to recap, this election is a complete toss-up. Every vote counts, and those infrequent voters might just be the ones to determine the winner.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And that leads to a really intriguing question. Will this election be decided by the usual suspects, the swing states,
Yeah.
the key demographics, or will something like this unprecedented gender gap completely upend our expectations?
That is the million-dollar question.
It is.
All about to unfold over the next week.
We'll be watching.
All right, listeners, buckle up.
This is going to be good.
We're just getting started with this deep dive. There's a lot more to unpack, and we'll be back after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
We'll be right back.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if we're witnessing a major shift in American politics.
I know, right? This whole gender gap thing is fascinating. Could this be the election where it becomes the deciding factor, overshadowing everything else? I guess we'll find out soon enough.
But
speaking of overshadowing, there's another big concern looming over this election, the potential for violence.
Yeah, you're right. It's a very real threat. The events of January 6th are still fresh in everyone's minds.
Yeah.
And it's definitely heightened anxieties
Yeah.
around the peaceful transfer of power.
We're hearing about some pretty extreme security measures at voting centers, snipers, panic buttons for poll workers. It's like something out of a movie.
It's a reflection of the times we're living in, unfortunately.
Okay.
But amidst all this tension, there is some interesting news on the early voting front.
Okay.
Michigan's Secretary of State reported that 1.7 million people have already cast their ballots.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah,
And it's not just Michigan. Nationally, over 44 million Americans have already voted.
that's right.
which is more than a quarter of the total votes cast in 2020.
Wow.
Are we seeing any patterns emerge from these early votes?
Well, it looks like things might be shifting compared to 2020. Back then, the early vote was overwhelmingly Democratic, largely because of Trump's claims about mail-in ballot fraud.
Exactly. Remember all the talk about rigged elections and stolen votes?
Yeah.
It really seemed to discourage Republicans from voting early.
Yeah.
But this time around, Republicans are embracing early voting.
They are?
So we're expecting a more balanced early vote, which could make things very interesting on election night.
It could.
So it's like the early vote is a preview of what's to come, but this year the preview might be a bit misleading.
That's a good way to put it.
While Election Day itself is still expected to favor Republicans, the early vote might be less polarized, which makes predicting the final outcome even trickier.
It really does.
Okay, so early voting is well underway, but let's talk about what each campaign is doing to win over voters in these final days.
Right.
We know the Harris campaign is targeting suburban voters and former Republicans, hoping they can offset potential losses among more traditional Democratic voters.
That's right.
Makes sense?
It's a smart strategy. First of all, suburban areas tend to have higher concentrations of college-educated voters
Okay.
who are statistically more likely to vote.
Yeah, that makes sense. They're more likely to be plugged into the political process
Mm-hmm.
and motivated to make their voices heard.
Exactly. And secondly,
Yeah.
these voters are increasingly unhappy with the direction of the Republican Party,
Right.
making them more open to a moderate Democrat like Harris.
It's that revenge of the norm we were talking about earlier. They might not be thrilled with the Democrats, but they're even less thrilled with the Republicans.
Yeah.
They're looking for a middle ground.
Right.
And Harris is trying to position herself as that pragmatic alternative.
That's the idea.
Okay, so Harris is going after the moderates. What about Trump? We're seeing him double down on immigration rhetoric, which has worked for him in the past.
Right.
But the question is, will it work this time?
It's clearly a move to energize his base,
Yeah.
but it also risks alienating those moderate voters who are crucial in a tight race like this.
Okay.
It's a balancing act,
Yeah.
and it's not clear if he's getting it right.
It's like he's playing with fire. He needs to keep his base happy, but he can't afford to alienate too many moderates in the process. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of election interference.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a huge concern,
A huge concern.
especially given what we saw in previous elections.
Right.
It's like a shadow hanging over the entire process, you know? It's crazy to think that foreign governments might be trying to influence our elections.
I know.
What are some of the ways this interference might play out?
There's the ongoing worry about misinformation and disinformation campaigns
Yeah.
designed to undermine trust in the electoral process.
Like that fake video that was circulating about burned ballots in Pennsylvania.
Exactly.
It's scary how easily people can fall for that stuff.
It is.
It's becoming increasingly difficult to separate fact from fiction, especially online.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's the potential for actual hacking or interference with voting systems.
Right.
Although, thankfully, security measures have been significantly enhanced since 2016.
For sure.
It sounds like we need to be prepared for a long and potentially chaotic election night.
Yeah.
With lots of uncertainty about the results.
That's right.
It could be days, even weeks, before we know the winner for sure.
It's a real possibility. We might not know who won on election night itself,
Right.
as many states will still be counting mail-in ballots
Mm-hmm.
and potentially dealing with legal challenges.
Okay. So patience is key. But in all this uncertainty, there's one group of voters who could really shake things up, that infrequent voters.
Exactly.
They're the wild card in this whole election.
Yeah, they are the wild card.
These are the folks who don't always make it to the polls,
Mhm.
and their participation or lack thereof could have a huge impact on the outcome,
Right.
especially in those nail-biting races where every vote counts.
That's right.
Like, they hold the key to the kingdom, but they don't always use it.
Exactly.
And what's interesting is that we're seeing evidence that Democrats are making some headway with this group.
That's right.
So are you saying the Harris campaign might be cracking the code of getting these infrequent voters to the polls?
Well, they're certainly trying.
Oh, yeah.
They've been actively targeting infrequent voters,
Yeah.
and it seems to be paying off.
Yeah.
They're seeing increased registration and early voting numbers among this demographic.
That's good news for Harris, as it could provide the extra push she needs to pull ahead.
Yeah, but it's not a guaranteed win.
Right.
Republicans are also trying to mobilize their infrequent voters,
Okay.
and it's still unclear which party will be more successful in getting them to the polls.
So it's a race within a race.
It is.
Okay. So Infrequent voters are a wild card. Let's talk about another one, Arizona. We mentioned earlier that early voting numbers there are favoring Republicans, and they have a registration advantage.
Hmm.
But what's the overall feeling in Arizona? Is it leaning one way or the other?
Arizona is truly a wild card.
Okay.
While some signs point to a possible Republican edge, it's still very much in play.
Okay.
We can't rule out a surprise victory for Harris.
It feels like Arizona has become the new Florida, a perennial battleground state
It has.
that keeps us all guessing until the very end.
Exactly.
Both campaigns are pouring resources into Arizona, knowing that it could be the state that determines who wins the presidency. That's right.
Okay, so we've talked about the national picture, the battleground states, and those demographic wildcards. Now let's bring it back to you, our listener. Why should you care about all this?
That's a great question.
What's at stake in this election? It's more than just who sits in the Oval Office, right?
Absolutely. This election goes beyond just the presidency.
Okay.
It's about the future of American democracy, the direction of our country, and the values we stand for.
And let's be real. The outcome of this election will have a real impact on your life.
It will?
The economy, healthcare, the environment, these are all on the ballot.
That's right. This isn't just some abstract political contest.
Yeah.
It's about the policies that will shape your everyday life for the next 4 years.
So what can our listener do to make their voice heard in this crucial election? What's the best way to make a difference?
The most important thing is to vote.
Yes.
Make sure you're registered, know your polling place, and have a plan for casting your ballot. Don't let anything stop you from exercising your right to vote. And don't forget to spread the word. Encourage your friends, family, and community members to do the same.
Yeah,
Every single vote makes a difference.
it really does.
It's not just your right, it's your responsibility.
Absolutely. And beyond voting, there are other ways to get involved.
Okay.
Volunteer for a campaign,
Yeah.
donate to a cause you believe in, or simply have conversations with people in your life about the issues that matter most to you.
Right. Get out there. Talk to people. And let them know what's at stake.
Yes.
Complacency is not an option.
Exactly. Democracy is a team sport.
Okay.
It requires active participation from all of us, not just on Election Day, but every day.
Okay, so we've covered a lot in this deep dive, breaking down the national scene, zeroing in on those key states and counties, and looking at those demographic factors that could really sway this election.
It's true. And we haven't even touched on one of the most fascinating and complex aspects of this race,
Okay.
the gender gap.
You're right, we keep dancing around it. But it's time to tackle it head on.
Let's do it.
Polling data suggests we could be looking at a historic gender gap in this election.
Right.
But what's at the heart of this divide? And how could it impact the final outcome?
This is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
The gender gap isn't just a simple case of men versus women.
Right.
It reflects deeper societal trends,
Yeah.
cultural shifts, and evolving attitudes toward gender roles and expectations.
It's about more than just who you vote for. It's about why you vote for them.
Exactly. And what we're seeing is a growing disconnect between how men and women view the candidates,
Yeah.
the issues, and the future of the country.
It's a complex issue
Very complex.
with deep roots.
Yeah.
So let's unpack some of the specific factors that might be driving this gender gap. We talked about the revenge of the norm and how suburban women could be a major force in this election.
Right.
But there's more to it than that, right?
Absolutely. Issues like abortion rights, healthcare, and education are all playing a significant role in shaping how women view this election.
We're seeing a surge in activism and political engagement among women, especially in response to the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Yeah,
It's like a political awakening.
it is.
And that energy is translating into votes.
That's right.
Women are showing up at the polls in record numbers.
They are.
And they're driven by a desire to protect their rights
Yeah.
and make their voices heard. So how is the Harris campaign capitalizing on this trend?
Well, they're doing a couple of things.
Okay.
First, they're making sure that issues like abortion rights and healthcare are front and center in their messaging.
Right. We're seeing this reflected in Harris's speeches, her campaign ads, and her social media presence.
Exactly.
It's a consistent message.
It is. And secondly, they're actively courting suburban women,
Okay.
recognizing their power as a voting bloc.
Yeah, it's interesting because the Republican Party has traditionally done well with suburban voters, but that seems to be changing.
Yes, the GOP's embrace of more extreme positions on social issues has alienated many suburban women who are seeking a more moderate, pragmatic approach.
They're looking for solutions, not ideology.
That's right.
They want someone who understands their everyday struggles, someone who's going to fight for them.
Hmm?
Okay, so we've talked about how the gender gap is working in Harris's favor, but what about Trump? Is he doing anything to appeal to women voters beyond his base?
Well, his strategy seems to be focused on maintaining his core base,
Okay.
which does include a significant number of women.
Don't forget, Trump won a sizable portion of the female vote in 2016. It's not like all women are opposed to him.
That's true. But his approval ratings among women have declined since then, and his recent rhetoric on issues like immigration and crime isn't likely to win over undecided female voters.
It seems like his strategy is more about holding on to what he has, rather than expanding his reach.
Right.
So could the gender gap be a major roadblock for Trump in this election?
It could be,
Okay.
unless he finds a way to connect with women voters beyond his base.
Right.
It's going to be tough for him to overcome Harris's advantage among this demographic.
He needs to broaden his appeal.
He does.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture, the issues, and the demographics, but let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What are each of the campaigns doing on the ground to mobilize voters and get them to the polls?
The ground game.
This is where the rubber meets the road, right?
Exactly. Both the Harris and Trump campaigns have invested heavily in building robust ground operations.
Okay.
It's not just about the big rallies and flashy TV ads.
Right.
It's about the hard work of knocking on doors, making phone calls, and getting people registered to vote.
It's like a political army, fanning out across the country, trying to win over every single vote.
That's a good way to put it. And this ground game is especially crucial in close races,
Yeah.
where a few hundred votes could make all the difference.
So what are some of the specific tactics each campaign is using? What's their playbook?
Well, the Harris campaign is focusing on building relationships with voters in key communities,
Okay.
organizing events,
Mm-hmm.
and using social media to spread their message. They're trying to meet voters where they are
Yeah.
and create a sense of excitement and momentum.
It's like a grassroots movement.
Yeah.
Building from the ground up.
Exactly. The Trump campaign, on the other hand, is relying more on traditional methods
Okay.
like rallies and direct mail,
Mm-hmm.
along with a heavy emphasis on online fundraising. They're tapping into their existing networks and trying to energize their base.
It's interesting how each campaign's ground game reflects their overall strategy and target audience.
Yeah,
It's like they're playing to their strengths.
exactly. And it's worth noting that both campaigns are also investing heavily in voter registration and mobilization efforts,
Yeah.
especially in those key battleground states.
They're trying to leave no stone unturned, trying to squeeze every last vote out of those crucial states.
That's right. Every vote counts in a close race like this,
Okay.
and both campaigns know it.
So let's zoom out for a moment and talk about the overall mood of the electorate. What are you hearing from voters? What's on their minds?
There's a palpable sense of anxiety and uncertainty out there.
Okay.
People are worried about the economy, healthcare, the environment, and the direction of the country.
Right.
They're looking for leadership and solutions, and they're not sure who to trust.
It feels like we're living in a time of great division and polarization. It's hard to find common ground, and everyone seems to be on edge.
It's a challenging time for sure.
It is.
And this election is reflecting all of that anxiety and uncertainty.
So what does this mean for the outcome of the election? Could this anxiety and uncertainty actually benefit one candidate over the other?
It's hard to say for sure.
Okay.
Historically, in times of uncertainty,
Yeah.
voters tend to gravitate towards the candidate they perceive as more stable and experienced.
Okay.
But this election is unique in so many ways.
Right.
It's hard to predict how those historical patterns might play out.
It's like we're in uncharted territory.
Yeah, we are.
Anything could happen.
That's what makes this election so exciting and so unpredictable.
Okay, so we've talked about the ground game, the mood of the electorate,
Mm.
and the general sense of unpredictability. But there's one more elephant in the room that we need to address. The missing elephant. I'm talking about Trump skipping the second presidential debate.
Ah, yes. The debate, that wasn't.
It was a bold move, opting for that rally at Madison Square Garden instead.
Yeah.
Do you think it was a smart move?
It's hard to say. By skipping the debate, Trump avoided having to defend his record and answer tough questions from the moderators in Harris.
Yeah.
But he also missed an opportunity to connect with undecided voters and make his case directly to the American people.
Right.
It's a trade-off, and it's not clear which side will benefit more.
Seems like he's playing a high-stakes game of political poker, and he just decided to fold his hand. We'll have to see how that plays out.
Exactly. It's a gamble, and only time will tell if it pays off.
Okay, so we've talked about polls, the debates, the ground game, and the mood of the electorate. But let's not forget about the heart of it all, the issues.
You're right. At the end of the day, elections are about more than just personalities and political maneuvering. They're about the policies that will shape our lives. It's about the future we're building together.
Exactly. So let's take a closer look at some of the key issues that are top of mind for voters in this election. What are you hearing out there? What's keeping people up at night?
Well, the economy is always a major factor in presidential races.
Yeah,
And this year's no different.
of course.
Inflation has been a big concern for voters,
Right.
and both candidates have offered their plans to tackle it.
Right. Everyone's feeling the pinch at the grocery store and the gas pump. What are the candidates proposing to do about it?
Harris has focused on investing in renewable energy and lowering healthcare costs,
All right.
arguing that those measures will help ease the burden on working families. Trump, on the other hand, has promised tax cuts and deregulation,
Okay.
saying that those policies will stimulate economic growth and bring down prices.
So the classic battle of economic philosophies, government intervention versus free market solutions.
You got it. And then there's healthcare, always a complex and contentious issue.
Yes.
Voters are deeply divided over the role of government in healthcare and the affordability of care.
It seems like everyone agrees that healthcare is a mess, but no one can agree on how to fix it?
That's a good way to put it.
Okay.
Harris has campaigned on expanding access to affordable healthcare through a public option, while Trump has called for repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act,
Right.
although he hasn't offered a concrete alternative.
So more government involvement versus less government involvement. It's a familiar theme. And what about climate change?
Yeah,
It seems like that issue is becoming increasingly important to voters, especially younger generations.
you're right. Climate change is a top concern for many voters,
Okay.
and it's definitely a defining issue in this election. Harris has made climate change a central part of her campaign, pledging to invest heavily in clean energy and reduce carbon emissions. Trump, however, has downplayed the threat of climate change and rolled back environmental regulations,
Yeah.
favoring policies that promote fossil fuels.
So we have a clear contrast on climate change, with Harris pushing for aggressive action and Trump taking a more skeptical stance. And let's not forget about immigration, an issue that's been front and center throughout Trump's presidency.
Right. Immigration is always a hot-button issue, and this election is no exception.
Of course.
Harris has called for a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants and a more humane approach to border security. Trump, on the other hand, has continued to advocate for a hardline stance on immigration, including building a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border.
So on immigration, we see a clash of values and approaches. Compassion versus security. It's a tough issue with no easy answers.
Absolutely. And it's an issue that resonates deeply with voters on both sides of the aisle.
Okay, so we've laid out some of the key issues that are shaping this election. Now let's bring it back to you, our listener. What issues are most important to you in this election? What are you thinking about when you cast your vote?
Yeah, take some time to reflect on what matters most to you and your family.
Yeah.
Do your research, compare the candidates' positions, and make an informed decision about who you believe will best represent your interests. Your vote is your voice. Use it wisely.
And remember, it's not just about choosing a president. You're also voting for members of Congress, state legislators, and local officials. Those races matter too.
That's right. Every election is an opportunity to shape the future of your community and your country.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the national political landscape, zoomed in on those crucial battleground states, and analyzed the issues that are shaping this election.
We have.
We've also discussed the importance of staying informed,
Yeah.
engaging in the process, and
Mhm.
making your voice heard through your vote.
That's right.
But there's still so much more to discuss. We'll be back after a quick break to delve even deeper into the complexities of this election. Don't go anywhere.
Stay tuned, because we're just getting started. We'll be right back with more insights and analysis.
Okay, so we're back. And before the break, we were talking about the issues
Right.
that are top of mind for voters in this election. I'm sure you're all out there trying to weigh all these factors
Yeah,
as you decide who to vote for.
absolutely.
Let's circle back to something we touched on earlier. The polls.
Okay.
They're everywhere this time of year.
They are.
And it's hard to ignore them. But how much stock should we really put into them?
That's a great question. Polls can be helpful in gauging the overall sentiment of the electorate.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that they're just a snapshot in time. They can change. And they don't always accurately predict the outcome of an election.
Especially in a race as volatile as this one. I mean, remember 2016?
Oh, yeah.
The polls had Clinton winning by a comfortable margin, and we all know how that turned out.
Exactly. The polls can be misleading, and we should never take them as gospel.
Right.
There are always surprises on Election Day.
Speaking of surprises, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Or maybe I should say the elephant not in the room. Trump skipping the second presidential debate.
Right.
And holding that rally at Madison Square Garden instead. What's your take on that?
It was a calculated gamble, for
Okay.
sure,
Sure.
by skipping the debate. He avoided having to directly address some of the criticisms against him
Yeah.
and answer tough questions from the moderators in Harris.
But he also missed an opportunity to connect with undecided voters and present his vision for the country to a national audience.
That's true.
Do you think it was a smart move?
It's hard to say. It might have energized his base,
Okay.
but it also could have alienated moderates who were looking for a more traditional candidate.
Right.
We'll have to wait and see how it plays out.
It's a risky strategy, that's for sure. All right, so we talked about the polls, the debates, the issues, the ground game, the mood of the electorate. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
And I think we've equipped you, our listener, with a pretty good understanding of what's at stake in this election and the forces that are shaping the race.
Absolutely.
But ultimately, it's up to each individual voter to decide who they believe will best lead the country.
That's right. Your vote is your voice. Use it wisely.
Well said. And with that, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. It's been a fascinating journey exploring all the twists and turns of this election.
It really has.
It feels like just yesterday. We were talking about the early primaries.
I know.
And now here we are, just a week away from Election Day.
It's flown by,
It has.
and it's only going to get more intense from here on out.
That's right. So buckle up, everyone. Get ready for a wild ride. And remember, no matter who you're supporting, your vote matters. So make sure you get out there and make your voice heard.
Absolutely. Every vote counts. And together we can shape the future of our democracy.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive
It's been a pleasure.
into the 2024 election. It's been a wild ride,
It has.
and we can't wait to see what happens next.
Stay tuned, folks.
We'll be back soon.